Can you hear me? I think you, sir, you have to unmute, sir. I can't hear you.
Okay, I don't know how. Okay, it had automatically.
No, it doesn't matter, sir. I understand totally. Anyway, welcome from me and Dr. Ritu.
Yeah. Hello. How are you? How are you? So now you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Great. Fine.
Shall we start, Ritu?
Yes, we can start.
Harita, are we ready?
Ma'am, we can start.
All right, sure. Thank you so much. Once again, a very warm welcome to you today morning for this particular program on existentialism. We are indeed very happy to have Professor Mangesh, and it is also one of those very beautiful days because it is Teachers' Day, as all of you know. I wish you all from the organizing team here on this day, and I do hope that you all carry fond memories of teachers and, the wishes and the cherished moments that you've had with teachers, as well as, the present teachers with whom you might be interacting, or some of us who are also teaching. The wonderful bonding that we have with students, I think that is something that is there in our hearts and minds forever and ever. So let me wish you all on this beautiful day, and hopefully we would be having no existential crisis, I suppose, with teacher-student bonding, but other kinds of existential crises that might come up. And I think I'm really happy to see that Professor Mangesh is talking on or giving the talk on contemporariness of somebody like Albert Camus. So I'm very sure that you would all enjoy his talk today. And let me say that I would like to give a few background details about him. After all, just you should be knowing a little bit about the speaker today that we are having. And it is indeed our pleasure to have him today, because I can find from the small bio note that he has sent us that he has been doing a lot of work connected to not just somebody like Albert Camus, but also in other areas which are interesting enough for anybody who would like to take up these kind of research areas. And I think many of the youngsters would be benefited by his not only his lecture, but by knowing the kinds of areas in which he has tried to work. He has been teaching political science to postgraduate students in India over the last 3 decades. He has also taught at universities in Malawi, Austria, and Germany. He is currently a professor and head at the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Savitribai Pune University, where he has successfully guided 6 Indian and foreign PhD students, as well as 5 MPhil students. He has published over 75 articles in national as well as international journals and 5 books. And these books are the ones that interest me, in fact. Global Masculinities, that has been edited by Routledge. Interdisciplinary Perspectives in Political Theory, edited and again from Sage Publication. India in World Affairs, which he has edited with Himalaya Publications. Politics in Maharashtra, edited again by Himalaya 1995. And A Terrorist of the Spirit by HarperCollins in 1992. He has also been a translator, translating the poems of V.A. Dahake. And he had been, and he is also, I suppose, in the editorial team of the interdisciplinary journal New Quest from 1998 to 2000, and also of the Sage journal Men and Masculinities during 2003 to 2018. Dr. Kulkarni has been a recipient of a Rotary International Grant for university teachers to serve in developing countries, the Indal Fellowship of the Asiatic Society of Bombay, an International Visitor Program grant of the US government, a research grant of the Rockefeller Archive Center in New York, and an Erasmus Mundus Scholarship of the European Commission. The Indian Council for Cultural Relations deputed him as the first visiting chair professor of Indian Studies at the University of Vienna in 2011. He has also been a guest fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla in 2013, and he was invited as a visiting scholar at the University of Uppsala, Sweden, and the University of Strasbourg in 2016. He served as the ICCR Chair Professor of Indian Studies at University of Leipzig during 2017. Dr. Kulkarni has, besides all these great things that we have been talking about as a scholar, I think what is important is he's contributed a great deal to critical masculinity studies since the 1990s, and he has been a fellow traveler of many civil society organizations wherein he has sought to try to bring in a gender just society. He is a national joint convener of the Forum to Engage Men, a member of the steering committee of Men Engage South Asia, and is involved in organizing the third Men Engage Global Symposium in November 2020. That is going to be happening sometime later. And I think all of you who are going to listen to him should catch him on these points and, try to maybe, build up a relationship if you are interested in gender studies or masculinity studies, because I think this is one of those areas that is upcoming. And I'm sure that today his talk would illuminating us all with a number of key ideas, because he comes not from literature, from a different background. And I think it is always good to hear people from different interventional backgrounds so that we get to know the interdisciplinariness of any subject. I welcome you, sir, and I'm indeed very, very happy to have you today with us. And I do hope that, we are I must tell you that we are waiting for the talk.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kalpana, for that very generous introduction. Let me ask once again, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you. Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Right. Also, I, of course, wish to thank both Professor Kalpana once again and Dr. Ritu Tyagi for inviting me in the first place. And because this seems like a really interesting exercise, and in the really I must compliment them for thinking of something like this, because the tendency often is to pursue topics which are au courant, as it were. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but which are topics or themes which are fashionable and currently widely discussed, etc. But it takes, I think, some amount of intellectual courage, perhaps, to go back to something like existentialism, because, as we know, the heyday of existentialism in Europe and the West, that was in the 1940s. By 50s, slowly, in fact, we see other sorts of influences taking over, be it structuralism, then neo-Marxism, then eventually post-structuralism, etc. But of course, existentialism remains, I think, undoubtedly, a very important part of the philosophical and literary and even political legacies of the 20th century. It is a part of these many legacies, positive legacies of the 20th century, I would say. And therefore, it is really nice to have a series like this. Now, I have noticed that this series has two features. One is that it has an emphasis on philosophy. Because, of course, existentialism was seen as, in fact, predominantly as a literary current, along with being a philosophical current. But somehow I see that here you have also, though this series has been organized by the departments of English and French, philosophical concerns are also very significant here. And the two thinkers that this series focuses upon are Sartre and Camus. I know that there were also lectures on Kafka, but somehow these two are central to the series. And there's going to be, I think, at least one more lecture on Camus. There has been at least one lecture on Sartre, and there's going to be one more on him. So these two are somehow central figures. So I'm going to keep these considerations in mind while making this particular presentation, which I have called Camus, our contemporary. Okay, now let's see. I think I'm supposed to speak for about 45 minutes or to 1 hour, and I'll try to be brief. Let's see how it goes. Now, of course, I'm going to talk about the contemporaneity of Camus. But before that, I also want to clear the ground, as it were, in some ways. That is, at least in terms of my perspective, how I look at Camus, and especially the relationship between Camus and existentialism. Right? Because that is, of course, the central theme. Existentialism is the central theme. Now, you see, generally in the academic field and in the broader intellectual domain also, we like to classify thinkers and works, bodies of work, and slot people into neat categories, the way a librarian classifies books, and that's part of our job as scholars. But at the same time, one sometimes gets the feeling that perhaps in the process we are kind of perhaps we do a little injustice to certain thinkers in the process, I feel. Take these two figures, Sartre and Camus. Sartre, of course, we all know, was the older of the two. And Sartre was the one who, at least in the 1940s, definitely described himself as an existentialist. We know he also delivered that famous lecture on existentialism and humanism, etc. But when it comes to Camus, was he really an existentialist? Did he see himself as an existentialist? Even in the 40s, Sartre himself then moved beyond existentialism and he became a Marxist. We know the story in the 50s and 60s, etc. But in the 40s, certainly he accepted the label. But did Camus accept it? I think we should ask the question, because existentialism is the larger theme of this series. And here I'll say something and then quickly then move on. My own feeling is that Camus should not be seen in some very simple, obvious way as an existentialist. Or by calling him an existentialist, we do not really fully grasp, I think, the complexity of his work. So, in 1945, for example, in an essay entitled Pessimism and Courage, he actually clearly said, I'm not an existentialist. And now he did accept the fact that there was a certain climate of thought, that was characterized as existentialism, and within it, there were certain kinds of concerns that he shared. For example, he says, it is essential for us to know whether man, without the help either of the eternal or of rationalistic thought, can unaided create his own values. Now, this is a question that he, of course, considered to be important. And this is something that he shared with the existentialists. But then he very clearly said, I do not have much liking for the two famous existential philosophy. And to tell the truth, I think its conclusions false. But at least it represents a great adventure of the mind. Now, this is what he very clearly said at that time in the 1940s. And we know that even, see, in the myth of Sisyphus, which had been published earlier, in fact, in the early 1940s, 42, he rejected both the religious and atheistic versions of existentialism. And then in 1945, in an interview, he openly distanced himself from the most famous exponent of existentialism at that time. And he said, Sartre and I are always surprised to see our names linked. We have even thought of publishing a short statement in which the undersigned declare that they have nothing in common with each other. Now, please note, this was way before they fell out. You know about the early 1950s sort of acrimonious exchange between them. This was much before that. And this was, I think, because, philosophically, if you look at it, then what you see is that, unlike Sartre, I think, Camus did not believe in the precedence of existence over essence, right, which was then seen as one of the cardinal principles of existentialism. And more technically speaking, that is Camus, unlike Sartre, did not ontologize absurdity, right? This is, I think, I'm not a person trained in philosophy, but this is, in fact, a point made by a philosopher, well-known philosopher, John Passmore, that Camus did not ontologize absurdity. So, that is to say, he did not see absurdity as a part of the ontological structure of the word itself. He saw it in relational terms. We know that. Famously, he said that absurdity emerges from the fact that there is a discord between the human search for clarity and the opaqueness of nature. So that is, I think, important to bear in mind. Also, eventually, of course, we know that the rift between Camus and Sartre, who were really friends at one point of time, this rift emerged and then widened. Philosophical differences were already there, and then there were sharp political differences subsequently in the early 50s, and that is another story. But very quickly, let me say that there were differences over the status of Marxism. Sartre increasingly became a Marxist. Camus, who in fact in his 20s had been an active member of the Communist Party in Algeria, which is where he was born, and he spent his youth there, he moved away from Marxism, became critical of Marxism. So this is another thing I just want to place on record. Now, having said that, now this brings me to the main theme, which is Camus' contemporaneity, or his influence, and how prescient he was or was not, etc. These questions. Now, I feel, of course, Sartre was enormously influential in many ways. Some ways he does remain influential, and particularly in India, I remember for a long time, especially on the left, amongst these people who considered themselves to be progressive and so on, Sartre was considered to be, far more superior intellectually to Camus, and politically far more progressive. This was the situation. And also, I think globally, many people on the left held these kinds of views. And yet, what I have found is that in every generation, from the 50s onwards, I find that, Camus also was received very warmly by many, including, for example, Merleau-Ponty. See, I think I should just mention this. Maurice Merleau-Ponty was a very important philosopher of that time, Sartre's and Camus' contemporary. And he was, like Sartre, had received, unlike Camus, but like Sartre, Merleau-Ponty had received a very rigorous training in philosophy, and he was a very, very major figure, one of the founders of French phenomenology, etc. And he was a Marxist, earlier and had introduced Sartre to Marxism, but by the 50s, he himself became critical of Marxism. And then, if you look at some of his writings in the Adventures of the Dialectic, for example, the book, then you find that he doesn't hardly ever mentions Camus there, but and in fact, Camus and Merleau-Ponty had an argument earlier about Marxism, but now you find, if you look at the substance of Merleau-Ponty's arguments and his critique of Sartre and Marxism, you find that in many ways, actually, he is saying in more rigorous philosophical language what Camus was saying about Marxism, okay, and its totalitarian sorts of tendencies. So this was in Camus' own generation. You had a major figure like Merleau-Ponty and also to some extent, I would say, Raymond Aron, who was a major sociologist and liberal thinker of that generation. They kind of tended to agree more with Camus in the case of Merleau-Ponty implicitly. In the case of Aron, I think a little more explicitly. Then in the next generation, you find that in the you remember the New Left of the 1960s, and now here we are going beyond France and say in the US, a major leader of that movement. That is Tom Hayden, born in 1939, who passed away only 4 years ago. He, has in a text published in 2012. This was in the context of this Occupy movement. He very clearly says, that, and I quote, "We agreed with French existentialist novelist Albert Camus, who argued that a previous generation of revolutionaries had sometimes rationalized horrific slaughters in the name of future utopias. Still, we wanted to argue carefully for a restoration of the utopian spirit amid the deadening compromises all around us." So this is the Camusian spirit, the spirit of rebellion. While Camus was critical of totalitarian kind of doctrines which claimed to be revolutionary, he himself nevertheless wanted what he called a more modest utopia that would not degenerate into, or that would not directly or indirectly support the politics of murder and mayhem. So then again you find the the 1970s, even after the emergence of the New Left and the relative decline of the New Left, you have the nouveau philosophes in France, who are of course who were and remain somewhat controversial, and especially Bernard-Henri Lévy, who was an important figure in that group, who's still active. He also and some of the other members of that group they really appreciated Camus' sort of humanism and his especially his critique of Marxism in the 50s. And they were, of course, writing in the 1970s. That's what I'm talking about. And if you look at Indian literature particularly, and globally, of course, Camus has been influential, but I find that here in talking about western part of India, I find that at least 3 or perhaps 4 generations of writers, have been influenced by Camus. Some of them have translated Camus' writings, and they have, at least one of them, Makarand Sathe, has published an article. He published it not so long ago in Economic and Political Weekly. So Camus has been really quite influential, no doubt, though perhaps not necessarily as glamorous as Sartre. Now, having said all that, now I want us to move into slightly deeper waters. Okay? That is, I'm trying to go into some aspects of Camus' philosophy, or rather, I'm trying now want to go into the philosophical structure of his thought, okay, from a certain perspective. But before that, I must also clarify that some of you might have got the feeling that as the concept note, which sort of talks about the nature of this series of which this talk is a part. That concept note talks about Camus' contemporary relevance in terms of range of phenomena, like things that are happening right now, such as, for example, the pandemic. And I'll just say a word about it. That, of course, soon after that pandemic started, within less than a month, I think the one book people around the world remember was, of course, Camus' La Peste, the plague, right? And I'm not going to say much about it, and nor am I going to really talk about, say, maybe the dozen ways in which Camus' ideas can be directly related to some recent happenings. That sort of temptation I'm going to avoid. But I'll just say one thing: this is a part of the history of ideas, or of history of literature, or reception of fiction and thought. See, this, of course, La Peste was much appreciated at that time, was seen also as a metaphor of fascism and so on, right? And then, after the initial welcome, slowly what you find is that in France, Sartre, of course, became critical of it, but also, if I'm not mistaken, Roland Barthes was critical of this kind of attempt to treat what they saw as the attempt to treat the plague as a metaphor. Now, the plague is sort of a natural phenomenon, right? And the fascism, for example, which it was supposed to represent in some way, metaphorically, is, of course, something which is political through and through. And therefore, they thought that this was somehow rather problematic, and that perhaps Camus was therefore not really capable. Sartre said it clearly, Barthes in some ways, that he could not really grasp the political dynamics of something like fascism, and he could not capture that in this metaphor. And of course, there is the post-colonial critique, which I won't go into at all. That's another huge area that had already been articulated earlier in France. And then after size Orientalism, that became, when post-colonial criticism became an industry, then Camus particularly became a whipping boy. And they said, now, for example, in The Plague, almost all his novels are set in, with the exception of The Fall, they are set in Algeria. And then the critics say, where are the Algerian Arabs in this, etc. And when they do figure, as in, for example, The Stranger or L'Étranger, then that is again deeply problematic, that they are objectified, etc. And we know that, in fact, the Algerian writer has recently written another novel which kind of is a fictional sort of a critique of The Stranger. So that is another way in which she remains still relevant and still very much part of our thinking. But the point is that debate apart, now you find that literally, we have another sort of pandemic, and at a point of time when we had thought that with science, technology, modern medicine, etc., that now something like this could not possibly have, created a challenge on this scale, right, globally. That humanity, we had never thought that a virus, would bring us down to our knees, great powers like the US even. But it has happened. And so once again, Camus' fictional reflections on this sort of a predicament, I think, have become sort of literally relevant. Leave aside the metaphorical part of it. Anyway, so by basically what I'm trying to say is that I'm taking this philosophy part of your concept note pretty seriously. And what I'm now going to do is to, I think, try and explain what I mean by his contemporary relevance in sort of philosophical, political terms. And to do that, I'm now going to use a concept or a set of concepts articulated by Stephen White, who is an American scholar, but contemporary American scholar, political theorist, in fact. But he did not put for advance these ideas or concepts in relation to Camus. He is operating on a different canvas. But while reading his work, I found that especially what he calls weak ontologies, the idea of weak ontologies that he advances, I found it to be very useful to elucidate the structure of Camus' thought and to make better sense of what seem like certain deep-seated contradictions in the structure of his of Camus' thought. All right. So, what are these? What is a weak ontology? According to White, first of all, let's see how exactly he uses this term, because ontology has certain normalized sort of a meaning in philosophy, but uh, White uses it in a specific sense. So he uses it to connote the most basic frames that we use both to access and construct ourselves and the world. And he says that he contrasts them, of course, with strong ontologies. Okay? So, and he then says, unlike their pre-modern and modern strong predecessors, weak ontologies do not assert metaphysical certitudes regarding the nature of the world, of political life, and the relationship between these two. Instead, weak ontologies offer epistemologically contestable and historically anchored interpretations of existence, which have cognitive, aesthetic, affective, and moral political dimensions. And so these weak ontologies enable us to think, feel, and inhabit the natural as well as social world differently. So what? Let's stay with this contrast a little bit more. So this, what do strong ontologies do? Strong ontologies of modern vintage project an assertive and disengaged kind of subject. Disengaged from what? That is disengaged or distanced from both the background, that is tradition, embodiment, and also from the foreground, that is external nature, other subjects, etc. And this subject uh, that is posited by strong ontologies, it is what White calls Teflon subject, right? Because it seeks frictionless momentum in its relentless pursuit of grandiose cognitive and political projects. For example, the possessive individualist citizen of bourgeois democracies, right? And the party state in the communist countries. They could serve as examples of such kind of subjectivity at the individual and collective levels, respectively. Now, says White, an irony of contemporary intellectual life is that the transgressive impulse of postmodernism often leads it to reproduce in another guise the problem of frictionless modern subjectivity. Now, we won't go into it right now, but otherwise, postmodernism, postmodernist currents of thought obviously project themselves as alternatives to the modern worldview. But here you find that somehow uh, they share this particular problematic feature, right? That is, postmodernism reproduces in another guise the problem of frictionless modern subjectivity. Now, weak ontologies, on the other hand, according to White, what they offer is an embodied and socially embedded subject which is imbued with a deep sense of humility towards being and an acute awareness of the fragility of our projects. Very importantly, the hallmark of such a weak ontology is that it signals its planes or folds each drawing attention to the insufficiency of the other. And they are linked only by virtue of what White calls a crease. Now, White explains this idea of planes joined at a crease as follows, and I quote, "It would mean refining the capacity to flesh out one kind of experience or attitude, namely the crease, in alternate ontological directions, that is the planes, with correspondingly different sensibilities." Now, I'm arguing that a hermeneutic inquiry into the axiological structure of Camus' thought, that is the way in which values are presented and interlinked within the structure of his thought. That's the axiological structure. So, if I believe that a hermeneutic inquiry, an interpretative inquiry into the axiological structure of Camus' thought reveals a weak ontological orientation. Now, please note once again, I think it should be clear that weak here is not used, the term weak, the adjective weak is not used negatively, on the contrary, in this context. That Camus' thought reveals a weak ontological orientation, which I think is quite in keeping with the late modern zeitgeist. Now, this I think can be demonstrated through a comparison with the thought of Sartre. On the cognitive plane, whereas Sartre tends to hypostatize absurdity. I think this is more or less what was earlier meant by the ontologization of absurdity. Whereas Sartre tends to, at least in his existentialist phase, tends to hypostatize absurdity. Camus scrupulously refrains from doing so, treating it more as a relational category. We have already seen this earlier. Similarly, in the affective and moral domains, Sartre takes an agonistic, conflictual view. You know the famous statement, hell is others. This is what a character says in Sartre's play, No Exit. Whereas Camus has a conception of being in the world which is anchored in solidarity. So, for example, take his famous Cartesian sounding statement, I rebel, therefore we exist. This is what Camus said. So, not surprisingly, I think, in the political sphere, Sartre subscribes to a Marxism that echoes Hobbes's emphasis on war being endemic to the state of nature. Hume's preoccupation with scarcity as a basic feature of primordial human existence, and Machiavelli's instrumental attitude towards violence. Camus, in fact, what I have, this particular, I must say that this particular characterization of Sartre's brand of Marxism, as being somehow, as echoing in some ways aspects of the ideas of Hobbes, Hume, Machiavelli, etc. This is Maurice Cranston's formulation in an essay called Sartre and Violence. Camus, on the other hand, as we know, he advocates a position that is redolent of the humane strands of democratic socialism. And even beyond that, actually, at heart, we know that he was an admirer of anarcho-syndicalism. And anarcho-syndicalism was actually a part of the French political intellectual landscape, living part in his lifetime and beyond. And there are some very moving tributes that you find, that have been the anarchists paying tributes to Camus. And I hope you know that anarchism, surely, it does not mean simply indulging in acts of violence, and there is that popular sense of anarchy. But here it's a political doctrine, which is deeply critical of the state and wants to replace it by a different type of non-repressive social and political order. So, in those who read French, for example, can look at a book called, published in 1984, and there are many others like this, I think. It's called Albert Camus et les Libertaires. And it's published by Volontiers Anarchiste, 84. So, he was very much an is an anarcho-syndicalist at heart. Now, this is anarcho-syndicalism again is somewhere close to Marxism, but it is very critical of Marxism because it wants, it places emphasis not on some kind of a vanguard party, like Leninist type of communist party, but it rather emphasizes forms of workers' self-organization that would then bring about emancipation, larger social emancipation. And it is, of course, completely anti-totalitarian in its thrust. So this is what Camus advocated. And yet now, see, the professional philosophers have, however, pointed out a dissonance among Camus' cognitive, affective, moral, and political positions. Right? Now, we know that he rejects suicide as a valid response to absurdity. Remember in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, he gives a number of reasons why. He says suicide is a major problem, is a philosophical problem, but he, of course, does not advocate it in any sense as a solution. In fact, one of the things that he says is that, and this is a typical, Camusian approach, of that period when he was young. And he says the body recoils from destruction, and the judgment of the body is as good as the judgment of the mind. And so he, and there are other reasons which I won't go into now. Those of you who read The Myth of Sisyphus, this. So he says that suicide is not a valid response to absurdity. Very quickly, for example, he says that absurdity is basically this relationship between human search for clarity and the opaqueness of the universe. Now, by committing suicide, what happens is you are just removing one of these two poles, right? That's the solution, etc. So, but then he talks about rebellion and the politics of rebellion in L'Homme Révolté, in book translated as The Rebel, early 1950s book. There, he seems to be saying that a true rebel, unlike a revolutionary, can kill and will kill without compunction. But a true rebel, even if he needs to kill in order to achieve justice, to fight oppression, exploitation, etc. Nevertheless, then that having committed murder, then the true rebel would sort of, like the historical Kalyaev, the Russian rebel of the early 20th century, that she would surrender himself or herself and then would virtually court death. Would virtually ask for capital punishment. So therefore, what it means is that Camus then recommends suicide because if you court capital punishment, it's kind of suicide, right? He recommends it as the only honorable way out of the quandary faced by the rebel who has had to murder an oppressor. Now, therefore, his critics point out that he rules that in his at the structure of his thought, suicide is ruled out in the first instance because it would both nullify the truth of absurdity constitutive of the individual's relationship with the world and negate the integrity of life. But it is endorsed in the second instance as atonement for the rebel's homicidal rupturing of the bond with a fellow human being, the person he has killed. So rupturing of the bond with a fellow human being. Now, this, I think, can be seen as a genuine tension characterizing the conceptual folds in Camus' thought. Remember, any weak ontology is characterized by this sort of, is likely to be characterized by a certain tension between the conceptual folds which it contains. Now, the crease, again, remember, the term crease has a certain technical meaning, which I explained earlier. Now, I think the crease that holds them together these two conceptual folds in his thought, and the tension that exists between them. That is, I acknowledge, but I think the crease that holds these folds together in a precarious unity is the Camusian notion of love. And I quote, he says, "I'm linked to the world by everything I do, and to men by all the gratitude I feel." Right? Now, this is actually from an entry in these notebooks that he kept. You may remember, the Le Carni. This was in 1936. He wrote this, and I believe that the idea of love is very important, and the linked idea of friendship. This is really my argument. Is, I think, very important to the structure of Camus' thought, if you look at the entire structure as a whole. Now, some of you might know that Camus planned his work in his writings in terms of cycles. The first cycle was about the absurd. The second cycle was about rebellion. Right? And so each cycle would typically consist of a novel, a play, and a sort of discursive type of, philosophical type of work. But the third cycle, there was also going to be a third cycle, which never really materialized. Mainly, we know, of course, due to his tragic death in 1960, right, in an accident. Now, but he did write about he has left some record of what he had in mind as far as the third cycle was concerned. So this third cycle was also to include a book on love, and love was going to be one of the major themes of the third cycle, as absurdity was of the first cycle and rebellion of the second cycle. And of course, though this work never saw the light of day, but there are significant references to this theme, that is love, in Camus' published work. And I think it often goes unnoticed, but love is a key motif in the fugue-like structure of the rebel. So, for example, in this book, The Rebel, L'Homme Révolté, in the course of his critique of historical revolt, Camus faults Hegel for refusing to foreground his own initial insight, Hegel's own insight, that love could bring about the mutual recognition of minds. Now, I have a long quote here, which I will skip. Then you find that philosophical preoccupation with the nature and significance of love can be found in the different strands of the Western intellectual tradition to which Camus was heir. And here I just quickly mention two thinkers. Camus had a fascination for the pre-Socratics, and the third cycle was actually going to involve a sort of a blend of poetry and philosophy that you find in the writings of the pre-Socratics. And here, Empedocles, for example. Empedocles was one of the pre-Socratics that he greatly admired, and the idea of love is important in the philosophical writings of Empedocles, which I'll not go into the details of this. And then, of course, he wrote, when he was very young, he wrote a dissertation where he discussed the ideas of Saint Augustine. And Saint Augustine also, as we know, gives central importance to a certain notion of love. To be precise, the notion of caritas, that is the love we should have for all our fellow human beings, corresponding to the love of God for humankind. Now, this, of course, Augustine being a Christian thinker, of course, everything that he says is related, has a theological context. But the notion of love, caritas, is important there as well. But what I really want to focus on a little bit before I wind up is the role played by this notion of love and a linked notion of friendship in Camus' work, especially the book The Rebel. But even more importantly, I want to look at this nexus between Camus' preoccupation with his ideas of love and friendship and Simone Weil's writings on this theme. And in a moment, I'll turn to that. But let me place this on record that if you take a good look at the rebel, he actually attributes there the malaise of his contemporaries to their incapacity for love, he says. And I quote, they no longer believe in the things that exist in the world and in living man. The secret of Europe is that it no longer loves life. And he himself treats love as an integral element of authentic revolt. And he says there, rebellion cannot exist without a strange form of love. So now Simone Weil is a thinker that not many people are aware of, or they're not aware of the significance of her work. She died really young. She was, I think, just in her 30s when she died. She almost, died of self-imposed starvation, but that's another story. I won't go into that. Now, she was actually a contemporary of Simone de Beauvoir, their classmates. And I think she was a very important thinker of that period, and of a, not at all, we couldn't just fit her into any of these categories, existentialist, Marxist, etc. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why she's fallen through the cracks of intellectual history. But Camus, of course, he never met her, but he was greatly fascinated by her ideas. And he helped bring many of the writings to light, helped publish those, get them published. Therefore, he was quite familiar with many of her key ideas. And so he might not have shared Weil's spiritual concerns, because she increasingly turned to Christianity, etc., Catholic version of it. He nevertheless, so leave aside the spiritual concerns, there were certain aspects of her thought, including, I think, her understanding of love, friendship, etc., which I think are very, very close to Camus' ideas, thoughts on the subject, and perhaps I'm sure he was partly inspired by the writings of Simone Weil, who he actually cites at different points. Now, here, I'm particularly thinking of Weil's forms of the implicit love of God. Now, here, what she calls implicit forms of the implicit love of God, they include love of the order of the world, of our neighbor, and friendship. Okay? And there is at least one other which I'm not mentioning, but these are the ones. These are, let's call them secular for the sake of convenience, secular aspects of this idea of forms of the love of God. Okay, now, and I think these would have resonated with Camus' sensibility, which was agnostic, yet open to a sense of the sacred. Now, Weil defines love as consent to the rule of mechanical necessity in matter and of free choice in each soul. And she says, I quote, "The face of this love, which is turned towards thinking persons, is the love of our neighbor. The face turned towards matter is love of the order of the world." And she considers the compassionate granting of equality even to those who are weak as a cardinal virtue. And she thinks the modern notion of justice, which distinguishes it from the love of our neighbor, is wrong, is faulty. And this is because, according to her, this notion of justice dispenses the one who possesses from the obligation of giving and the one who receives from the obligation of expressing gratitude without losing his dignity. Okay. And she therefore counsels the restoration of the original unity between justice and love. What is it originally? What does the term is the she's thinking of how Greeks or the gospel of the pagan or Christian traditions thought of love and justice. So she therefore counsels the restoration of the original unity between justice and love. And she says, only the absolute identification of justice and love makes the coexistence possible of compassion and gratitude on the one hand, and on the other, of respect for the dignity of affliction in the afflicted. So, and so to her, friendship is a pure form of personal and human love, which is based on affection, equality, reciprocity, and respect for each other's autonomy. Right? And she thinks that though it's a bond between two persons in a deeper sense, true friendship is impersonal. For the desire to please and the desire to command are both absent from it, and this is conducive to partiality. So I am arguing that it would be reasonable to speculate that Camus would have, or he might have actually wholeheartedly assimilated the essence of love, this position, by his position, which I have just outlined. Okay? Minus its sort of theological underpinnings or theological aspirations, I would say. And therefore, I feel that at a time now, today, when ethnic and religious discord finds expression in genocide and terrorist fundamentalism, and now when the critique of heteropatriarchy has triggered off gender wars, we need concepts and norms that can accommodate difference within a framework of universality, thereby providing a platform on which people of very different orientations would meet to craft a truly humane socio-political order. And I think it is for this reason that Camus' open-ended, unconventional exploration of love and friendship remains exemplary. This, I think I have more to say about this, but I'm running out of time. So I'll just quickly summarize this by saying this part of my argument. And I'm actually coming to the end of my presentation. So basically what I'm going to say, I want to say here is that see, Camus and Weiss thinking about friendship is closer in some ways to the classical notion of friendship as a civic bond. It's not just not merely an interpersonal relationship, which is the modern understanding, the latter. And we know that another kind of notion of fraternity emerged during the French Revolution and thereafter. We know that, and that's a more democratic kind of understanding of, let's say, of friendship. So I am arguing that if the classical conception of friendship is married to the more capacious democratic ideal of fraternity in a Camusian spirit, the resulting synthesis may give us both a theoretical and practical purchase on the seemingly intractable problem of welding diverse and often conflicting communities into some semblance of civitas. So this might seem like wishful thinking to you, but I think here's just an idea that I'm offering. And I've found also in his writings, and this is actually again from that those diaries that he kept as early as 1937. I found there is certain notion of friendship with the non-human world, right, which I think could be our only hope of attaining ecological sanity. Right? And I think Camus' worldview had a place for such an ethic of care based on some sort of a notion of friendship with the non-human world. And this, I find sort of the justification of this, at least one of the ways in which I can justify this is by citing entry from his diary in 1937, and he is in Florence, and he just visited the cells of the Franciscans, who you know that they believed in voluntary poverty and so on, the vow of poverty. Now he says, and I quote, "There is an extreme point," says Camus, "at which poverty always rejoins luxury and richness of the world. If they cast," they meaning now the Franciscans, "if they cast everything off, it is for a greater and not for another life. Being naked always has associations of physical liberty, of harmony between the hand and the flowers it touches, of a loving understanding between the earth and men who have been freed from human things." Now, I think there is more wisdom in these youthful observations, right, than meets the eye. And I think it can provide the basis for a non-anthropocentric, yet humane because of it. There are other things also which I can say, other respects in which, for example, people like me who are interested in political theory find strands of thought in Camus' work, which are very relevant to ongoing debates in political theory. For example, around deliberative democracy. Right? To give you just one example. But my sense is I'm running out of time, so I will sort of quickly, say what, in a nutshell, I think about his contemporary relevance. I feel that unlike the doctrines of many celebrated thinkers of the last century, which already seem dated, Camus' thought continues to be a source of inspiration through its spirit of measure. And by measure, I mean here what he calls mesure, and that in turn is derived from the Greek notion of sophrosine, right? A sense of measure as opposed to hubris, which is overweening pride. Okay, so through its spirit of measure or mesure, its advocacy of relative values. Please note, I'm not saying relativist, but relative values and approximative thought, and its acknowledgement of its own fallibility. That is Camus' thought, offers an ontological orientation to the self and the world, which is attuned to the requirements of the late modern zeitgeist, as I've already said. And in its critique of the hubristic grand narratives of European modernity, Camus' thought prefigures many themes currently championed by the postmodernists. But unlike the latter, Camus offers a constructive view of human nature and a positive project of emancipation. Therefore, I think in an era characterized by the end of history impasse, Camus' thought or legacy provides both the utopian energy and some of the conceptual resources needed to reinvent humane socio-political order. Having said all this, let me just end by quoting a few lines from a poet I think that we all admire, that is T.S. Eliot. And these lines that Eliot happened to write in the 1930s in Camus' lifetime. It has not, of course, these lines have nothing directly to do with Camus, but I think they really, in some way, they do capture the essence of the man. And if you can talk about an somebody who's labeled as an existentialist in terms of an essence. But yeah, I think it does capture the spirit of Camus' life and thought. Okay, and these lines, these are Eliot's lines. I will just recite them and then end. He who has seen what has happened and who sees what is to happen, the witness, the critic, the stranger, that I think was Camus. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Kulkarni, for that very insightful talk on Albert Camus. And I would place on record the fact that he was the first speaker who got finalized for this webinar, because he was very swift and prompt in his response. I contacted him through a colleague who works in the French department at University of Mumbai, and he was the first one to immediately accept it with a lot of enthusiasm. And for that, I thank you on my personal behalf and on behalf of our team for your very swift and prompt response in accepting it. He is, as you have seen, as is manifest from his talk as well, is a scholar on Camus, and that is why he was recommended to me through a colleague. And we are very happy to have been a part of this lecture, where you have very efficiently first tried to locate Camus within his contemporaries, and particularly keeping yourself very close to the philosophical movement of existentialism, particularly because Camus was one who distanced himself in a very conspicuous manner. So it is important for us to revisit him within that framework to understand how we could think of him as an existentialist and not. So I think that came out in the lecture in a very efficient manner. And I was particularly impressed by your readings of how you used the framework of weak ontologists, drawing on Stephen White's idea of weak ontologists, and how you elaborate on the idea of how you look at the idea of love and friendship being the crease moments, the key moments that try to resolve in a certain way, if we could say, though it is difficult to talk about resolution of any kind when one talks about existentialism, but finding some sort of solace in the idea of friendship and love, and how you stretch that idea of love and friendship also to relationships, because this has been a key question for philosophy in general, the relationship with the other, and many have said a lot on that. So we are also grateful that you've pointed out the relationship that Camus sees with the other through the prism of friendship and love, and how you've stretched that idea of friendship even to the non-human, to see how Camus' works can be relevant to us today when we are facing not just the pandemic, but also, so many environmental challenges. So thanks a lot for that. And maybe we can take a couple of questions, and the moments that you had when you wanted to elaborate on a lot of things, but you had to stop yourself thinking of time. Perhaps those questions will open again, relate to those moments that you had, and maybe we'll be able to take you back to those points that you have in mind. So having said that, perhaps I can scroll back and look at some of the questions. Also, one more thing, that he is the only political scientist that we have amongst us. We are a group of literary scholars mostly. So a lot of questions, are coming from that thought process. So yes, the first question could be a tricky one for a political scientist. And it's coming from a literary scholar asking, what are the typical characteristics of existential work of literary art? There are two people who are interested in, this question. And then further elaborating on it, the person asks, how can we tag a literary work as an existential work? Because you begin your reflections, your deliberations, starting with the notion of, how we tend to, as academicians, tend to categorize and easily fall into those traps.
Yeah, right. So that is what I would personally, both I agree, on both points I agree with you that I am, my primary training is in political science, not literature. And, but more importantly, the second point, which you actually sort of, when you were referring to what I said at the outset, and I would really like to reiterate that. Beyond a point, I think it's not very helpful to label works of art or writers or artists, and in these terms. As we saw with regard to Camus, he in fact refused to call himself an existentialist, and I don't think that was just some kind of brand politics, as we would call it today, that he wanted to create a different brand, etc. And yet, of course, there are certain movements, currents of thought, and there is a climate of thought, etc. And there are, broad currents like surrealism is one of them, Dadaism is another. Okay, modernism is a very broad current, and you can make sense of, no doubt, especially when you're academically analyzing works of art or literary works, you can make sense of those, no doubt. And there, I think there are people better qualified than me to comment upon that. What are the characteristics of a work, literary work, that can be legitimately called existentialist? But let's put it this way. I would say that then, in that sense, an existentialist work would obviously be one that, in some sense, exhibits through the medium of literature some of the key preoccupations of uh, existentialist thinkers like Sartre. And often, in fact, it's the same person who is in one context writing as a philosopher, in another context also producing literary works. For example, Sartre's the trilogy, I think it's called Roads to Freedom, right? Chemin de la Liberté. So that was produced at a time when he was very much, functioning as writing as an existentialist thinker. So you can see all those concerns with, freedom, the idea that man is somehow condemned to freedom, and then what does one do with that freedom? And the idea that one's life is, in a certain sense, a kind of a project and has to be really treated as such if one wants to live authentically. And therefore to be guided by traditional morality or traditional institutional structures, practices, etc., is somewhere a kind of is to be really inauthentic. And of course, certain very key themes, such as what happens to human beings in the face of death, and when you particularly confront death in the absence of traditional religious faith, etc., that beliefs which otherwise provide solace to you. So what happens when you really face some of these, what say for Sartre would be actually ontological features of human life? When you see them and confront them in their sheer, in their starkness, then what happens? And when you see human life, whether you're looking at individuals or interpersonal relations, or indeed political choices, etc., that people make, and all kinds of moral political choices, in the light of this kind of a framework, this understanding of human freedom, of the human predicament, of the sort of anxiety that it induces, and then those would be then legitimately called, I think, existentialist works. And interestingly, this is the last thing I want to say. In India, I think, somehow Camus, Sartre, etc., their works became available through translations and through these Penguin paperbacks, etc., in the 50s. This also reception history, perhaps literature people would know more about it, and perhaps something has been written on this. So then you find that in India, it is what in this part of India, for example, we call the Sattvottar Pidi. That is those who started writing after 1960, who came into prominence, like Balchandra Nemade, to give you one example, in his novel Kosla, which has been translated as Cocoon. So you find in this generation, a lot of these sorts of existentialist concerns begin to emerge. And so there is a body of literature in Indian English, in India, and as well as in other languages in India, from 60s, especially 60s, 70s, etc., which exhibits some of these features. In France, of course, as you know, by the 50s already, other things had taken over, right? Like Chausseism and so on, right? That story you know. But in India, somehow, it was in 60s that existentialism started having this kind of resonance. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
Yeah, actually, we do get these kinds of answers, these kinds of questions pretty often in our forums. And a lot of it has to do also with the way we deal with many of these writers, because within our pedagogical approach, within the literature departments, we do have the survey courses where you tend to look at the different movements and how chronologically they find their place within the literary history. So there is almost a sense of anxiety in the students to, club these writers into certain kinds of categories in order to also simplify, if I could say, the understanding. But there is the other approach also where you look at the counter view of it. That yes, there is, that this person perhaps was clubbed into a particular group. But then there are all these tensions within the work that point to certain other things. So those kind of approaches are also there. So thanks a lot for that answer. The next question is, in Myth of Sisyphus, don't you think that we can find the reflection of the Dionysian idea of Nietzsche?
The Dionysian idea of Nietzsche. Yeah, well, Nietzsche was a major influence on French thought. Uh, in fact, over some decades in the 20th century. You know that this influence continues in different ways later on uh, in the work of Foucault, Michel Foucault, then in the work of uh, Deleuze and Guattari and so on and so forth. So that is, but the beginning, I think it was in the 40s really, 40s, 50s that Nietzsche's ideas began to influence French thought, and that includes, of course, the existentialists. And we know that any good textbook will give you will cite Nietzsche as one of the sources of existentialist thinking. And yeah, it is true that at a certain point, Camus was influenced by Nietzsche. But we also know that whether now Nietzsche was responsible for it or not is another story. But the fascist Nazis later on invoked Nietzsche all the time as one of their sources of inspiration. Right? And in The Rebel, particularly, if you see that book, there is an elaborate discussion of Nietzsche. And from this point of view, especially, how to place it politically. And broadly, Camus' position on Nietzsche is that he says that in Nietzsche, there are so many ambiguities and complexities. He does say things which are terrible, but then there are also other places and other thoughts in his corpus, which kind of provide a corrective to these problematic sorts of formulations that you find elsewhere in the writings of Nietzsche. Right? But in the myth of Sisyphus, which in some ways is it is a very youthful, somewhat raw kind of piece of work. By Dionysian, if you mean something where, for example, the body and its needs and desires, etc., are very important, then that is of course there. It's undoubtedly there, and you know that in that book, Camus says what is really important is not the best living, best as in ethically, etc., but the most living abundantly, as it were. And this could be in some ways related to. I mean, I'm just saying this offhand. I mean, one would need to go deeper into it, no doubt. And also, of course, the Nietzschean spirit of questioning, of not taking anything for granted, of especially questioning all these traditional pieties, etc. So much so that Camus, in fact, even very severely criticizes some of these existentialists or proto-existentialists like Kierkegaard, for example, for taking the easy way out by sort of advocating belief in God, the faith as a response to the absurd or absurdist predicament. So so there are important sorts of commonalities between Nietzsche and Camus, no doubt, even in the myth of Sisyphus.
The next question is by my colleague from Department of French at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And as a French reader himself, he wants to know what are your readings of La Peste, the plague in the contemporary times of the pandemic?
Actually, I really wish to revisit and reread the plague. But I have not done that. I have read the plague at least twice or thrice, but that was much earlier. But as I said, already as I have said, I think the plague, in some sense, is now literally relevant to our predicament. The sort of responses people have, which are depicted very vividly in the plague by Camus, in the novel, to a situation like this. I mean, there are so many echoes of it that we find now that, I mean, it's for each of us, I think, to really discover this. I don't think there is anything like a formulaic answer, some correct way of interpreting the novel, The Plague, in the light of what we're going through right now. And then, of course, I don't think you'll be able to find a sort of one-on-one kind of correspondence. Right? There are, for example, though as I said, I read the book a long time ago. There is the narrator, Dr. Ria. Okay? He has a certain approach. Then there is Taru, right? Who has another, and then there is, I think his name is Father Panlu, right? So he looks at it through a certain kind of Christian religious lens. So these, and then there are of course so many other characters, and there are other ordinary people there who are looking. But one thing I would say, okay, just one thought that occurs to me. Camus was criticized, has been criticized for leaving out the Arabs, the Algerian Arab population, though it is said there. But I think all these characters, most of them are actually white people, the Pied Noir, I think, more or less, the settlers. And from that point of view, and whereas we also witnessed here in India the fate of the predicament of the migrants, these people working in the informal sector, and the way they suffered. Right, so maybe there is a lacuna in Camus' novel, and there is, which in some ways corresponds to our sort of callous attitude, I think, by and large, to the suffering of the migrants.
I think Dr. Kalpana wants to add something. Do you wish to add something on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to add this particular point that the plague is very interesting because it brings in, to a certain extent, a very similar context of fear and anxiety that were there, that has started when the pandemic came. That situation is brought out in the plague too very beautifully. It also brings in this context of the doctor, and who endlessly works for the people, and who is also at loggerheads with the system, because when he tries to tell the system that there is a problem, nobody is ready to listen, because they think it is something that is just happening and they do not want to listen to him. And as Professor Kulkarni was pointing out, I think it is very interesting to look at the power dimensions there also, because the ones who seem to have better access to things seem to be getting better things, whereas the ones who do not have, like who are part of the lower economic groups, do not have anything. And it also creates this problem that some of the people who have come into that particular town are unable to go back, and they want to go out of this town at any cost. And how do they manipulate the resources to get out? So I think in many ways, it is a very contemporary work which talks about the situation we are in today. And I think it is really good that we had a work like that so many years back, that we can go back to and look and see how, the various kinds of sections of interventions have happened throughout. So I just wanted to add that point. That's all. Thank you for that.
Thank you. We'll go over now to our next question. What is Camus' view on free will?
But let me say, first of all, that Camus was not a philosopher, in the sense in which Sartre was a philosopher, or Merleau-Ponty was a philosopher, to mention two contemporaries, or Simone de Beauvoir for that matter, or Simone Weil even, I would say. Let's not forget that his, education was not comparable to that of these people. Camus' education stopped when he left Algeria. And so he was like, that was a colonial outpost. And whereas these other Sartre, etc., were products of the elite educational system, including, they were, what do you call them? They were normaliens, right? So they went to those kind of places, École Normale Supérieure and so on. And then some of them subsequently, they were also teachers. Sartre was, till he decided to write on a full-time basis. Merleau-Ponty remained a professor and so on. So Camus was not there for an academic philosopher. That is one thing we must remember. And therefore, I'm not sure if it is even really quite, apart from my own limitations, whether to what extent I understand Camus' ideas about free will. I would say that those were not really his preoccupations. He did not produce technical philosophy. And Sartre, as you know, particularly in his bullying way, and especially in that early 1950s exchange, often sort of pointed this out. He sort of tried to project Camus as a sort of half-baked thinker who was philosophically incompetent, etc. But of course, if you look at his fiction, then and his discursive writings, then it would be possible somehow to reconstruct, okay, or to construct, let's say, a position that could be called a distinctively Camusian position on something like free will. Right? But just one very quick thought, which is that uh, I think in that it also comes up in the Camus-Sartre debate. Somehow Camus accuses Sartre and even in the book The Rebel, the Surrealists, etc., uh, of somehow excessively emphasizing the human capacity to change things, to bring about changes in their own life, in social life, and very radically, etc. That's I think part of what was meant by White when he talked about strong ontologies. Right? Whereas Camus himself subscribed to, I think, a more modest notion of what humans could will and what they could achieve in practice, by exerting their will. And so that corresponds more to the idea of weak ontology. But I know I'm saying, look, I'm not a philosopher, and therefore, but I am, of course, accountable to you on this count, because I did invoke philosophical ideas, etc. And what I presented was a kind of philosophical analysis. But this is what I would say for now, and maybe I need to take a closer look at his work.
Right. Thank you for that. The next question is by Professor Kalpana herself. Do you feel his work, The Outsider, brings in the politics of being a human being? So taking you back to politics, the power of institutions and a critique of lack of compassion.
Yes, that is, in fact, that has been one of the dominant readings of that text. And if I remember right, Camus himself actually said somewhere that he is the Merceau is like the Jesus of our times. He's the only kind of Jesus we deserve. Please correct me if I'm wrong. He says, Camus himself says something like this. What does that mean, after all? We know that Jesus in his own lifetime was actually radically critiquing through his life and through his message, and the two were not different. The institutional order, and especially including the those who exercise secular and religious authority at that time, and he was indeed, of course, what else was he advocating if not love and compassion, etc. But now the thing is with Merceau, as you know, Merceau is a man of few words. Merceau is a very taciturn man, right? And therefore, Merceau himself has no message really. And in fact, the man who produced that manifesto, the new novel manifesto, who was himself a novelist, you remember? He actually, in that very manifesto, he said that there is a disjunction between Camus, the first part of L'Étranger, and the second part. He says the first part is, as it should be, where it's very objective and so on. Whereas the second part becomes too verbose and etc. Right? And that is where actually Camus is, Camus and through Merceau actually. So Merceau is saying many things, is reflecting on his life, especially towards the fag end, no? When he's in his prison cell and is reflecting on the past, etc. But otherwise, he's not the type who would reflect who would comment and who would exhort in particular, etc., in that manner, the manner of some prophet or social critic even. So there is surely there is a critique of let's say the existing order of what would be called bourgeois bad faith, actually, let's say. That is definitely present there. Why else would Camus say is the only kind of Christ we deserve? And yet we know that the post-colonial critics, this beginning with Side, and before that actually there were some in France itself, who said that Camus himself was, and the character he created, very insensitive towards the suffering of the Arabs. And that finally, and that he says that even this is so unrealistic to show the colonial court accusing a white, sentencing a white man to capital, sentencing him to death for killing an Arab.
Absolutely. There are a lot of writings on his treatment of the Arabs, and also on the fact that this doesn't seem to be a very convincing novel for the reason that a white person gets accused for that. So those are certain controversial issues, I believe, with the novel, and how they are read, that is of interest, I think, to many of us as post-colonial critics also.
Oh, by the way, the guy I had in mind, that is Alain Robbe-Grillet, who wrote this manifesto, the Nouveau Roman manifesto, who said this, about the disjunction between the first and second part.
Very interesting. Then I take you back to philosophy with another question, asking how far do you think has this philosophical school influenced the Indian literary scene? You mentioned a couple of writers who were influenced by the Camus idea of.
Yeah, definitely. Now, for example, this is a book that I've read the original Marathi version of it, so I should talk about it. That is Balchandra Nemade. He's a very major novelist. I think is known throughout India. And his novel, which was published in around 1963, called Khosla, which means the cocoon, and which has been translated into English, by the way. It's available. So that novel, if you see, very clearly reflects this sort of existentialist kind of worldview, and there is even a sort of an allusion to Camus, which is woven into the texture of that novel, I remember. And and he is just one. There are many others, and those who are more knowledgeable about literatures in other parts of the country would be able to cite these other examples. But as I said to you, even somebody like my contemporaries, like Makarand Sathe, who I mentioned, those who are interested can look up his article on Camus in the Economic and Political Weekly. So, and before that, yes, let me also mention one very important figure. And this person was a bilingual writer. He wrote in English and in Marathi, and in fact, I think most of his literary writings are available in both languages. And also, at least there is one French translation of his writings that I know of. And this person is Vilas Sarang. Vilas Sarang, who wrote, have you seen a book that came out in 1992, that is 50 years after the publication of L'Étranger? And this is an edited work which brings together essays written by people from around the world, including writers and scholars, etc., on L'Étranger. And this has two Indian contributions at least. One of them is by Sarang, and it is called, and the title itself is very interesting, A Brother to the Stranger. Please read that, Brother to the Stranger. And this, of course, is the literal part of it is the truth. There is that Sarang was born in 1942, exactly. And but Sarang says this. I don't know if he says this in this essay, but he has also written about Camus in Marathi, and I remember reading it many years ago. Sarang says that reading Camus, reading L'Étranger specifically, has become a part of the very process of growing up in our times. All right. So I think in many ways, the sort of worldview represented by L'étranger contributed to what the Germans would call Bildung, the cultural formation of many Indian writers. And you will see this. Of course, it's not a pure just plain imitation. Otherwise, it would be really very sad. And by the way, Marathi, which I don't think has. It's not that we have a lot of good literature from around the world that's translated into this language. It's not so. But L'étranger, there are, I think, something like 3 translations at least that I know of. Yeah. So that shows that somehow Camus has bulked large. And there is one lady, I don't know why her name escapes me. She has written a couple of books on Camus and India. Okay, she's a Delhi-based author, and even Camus and Upanishadic philosophy, and I think it's a bit far-fetched. But there are these at least two books. And I think one of them deals at length with this question of Camus' influence on Indian writers.
Right. So with that, I go to the next question. What would be Camus' response to the contemporary rise of right-wing discourse and failure of neoliberal democracy in politics? How do you place Camus in the larger ideological spectrum?
Yeah, as I said, Camus, I mean, he lived during a time that was intensely political, right? And therefore he simply had to take a political position. It's not that he was, let's say, temperamentally attracted to politics, though he did get involved in politics when he was quite young. I mean, as I said to you, he was member of the Communist Party in Algeria. And he saw these two things as going together, his interest in literature, theater, particularly theater, and this kind of left-wing sort of politics. Or okay, let's leave aside the term left-wing. Let's say it's a kind of a politics which throughout his life inspired him, which was where he said that we have to write, even as writers, he said we have to write in such a way that we give voice to those who are defeated, those who are humiliated, right? The victims of history, those who cannot speak for themselves, etc. Even as a writer, that's our mission. And then, of course, translated into politics, it meant then supporting the cause of the subaltern, what today's terminology would call the subaltern. And when he was very young, remember, he was a journalist in Algeria. And later also continued to write when he was in France. He continued to publish in the newspapers, etc. Commentaries on contemporary affairs, political affairs, etc. And many of these have been collected also, put together. And there is a series of his the Actuel series, where they have been put together, these writings. And here you see, even while he was quite young and he was a journalist in Algeria, he supported the cause of the people living in the mountains, who were even within the so-called quote-unquote native population, they were the ones who were really suffering and living in poverty, and they had been neglected by the administration and by the larger society, etc. I think it's called Misera Kabili. You see that piece. So he had this kind of and one other thing, the tension in his work and in his thought and life between this, the desire to concentrate on his own literary kind of work and the need to take a political stand, to intervene in politics. There is a story. He had just one collection of stories, right? Exile in the Kingdom, in which there's a story, I think it's called it's a name, Jonas. This is about a writer or artist who at one point goes up into his loft, and then finally, much later, people wonder what's happening to him, and then they find that all that he has done, written there, or drawn, is this, there is a sort of word we can't make out, whether it means solitary or whether it is solitaire or solidaire. So this tension is always there in his thought. But let's be very clear that, for the sake of convenience, if you think of that left-right kind of spectrum, he was very much a man of the left, though he was opposed to communism. As I said, he was sort of democratic socialist, or today you may also use the milder term social democrat, though at heart an anarcho-syndicalist. So, and definitely opposed to all kinds of right-wing sorts of politics, opposed to fascism, Nazism, anything that shared aspects of these currents of thought and this kind of politics. So he would have, been in despair, I think, looking at how the direction in which the world has gone, and especially the rise of this kind of fundamentalism. Right? And now very quickly, I would say, and I tried to suggest it, that I think there are some resources in his thought, something I could only gesture towards, and the idea of deliberative democracy. I think some of these problems that liberals are facing or the left is facing, it has also to do with practices and with the worldview and with assumptions that somehow restrict this kind of politics to only a small elite coterie, let's say. I think the left and the liberals have somehow failed to build bridges in a genuine sense with larger popular strata. Now, this was something that within the Marxist tradition, as some of you would know, was also Gramsci's preoccupation in the 1930s, etc. Antonio Gramsci. I don't think Camus knew about him. It's very doubtful. But so this sort of thing. But okay, let me say this: that Camus and I discovered this rather late, had a great admiration for Gandhi. And he wrote one newspaper article on him in particular, which I have translated into English. It's available in Gandhi Mark. And I have also a longish piece on Gandhi and Camus where I talk about the things they had in common. Gandhi, of course, had no idea of Camus. So he wanted, I think, what did he see in Gandhi? One of the things he probably surely saw was here was a man who could take, who could go to the masses, though he doesn't put it exactly in these words, or he doesn't restrict his appreciation of Gandhi to this. And Gandhi, as we know famously, was not, he never confined himself to liberalism or even the typical left way of thinking, etc. And in fact, the liberals and the left, whenever they think about Gandhi sincerely, I think even today, then they have problems with him, because there are so many aspects of his thought which cannot be confined within that left liberal kind of view. So similarly, and this is a large theme, I won't go into it, but I think I tried to gesture towards some of these themes, that within Camus there are some resources that the left, those on the left and those who are liberal can find and should discover and make use of. I think, as I said, one of the things I said, that here is a man who's not a militant atheist. So when you're talking of something like fundamentalism, if you talk to them from a purely atheist position, it's not going to work. He was an agnostic person who nevertheless had a sense of the sacred. So Camus somewhere, I think, indicates gestures towards that particular ground where we can where we can engage with the larger, with the masses. And masses doesn't have to mean people who are not educated, etc. I mean, I'm saying those who are beyond that narrow elite circle. If we are to engage in some kind of dialogue, then there are resources to be found in Camus. And finally, I would say that, in fact, Camus often used to talk about civilisation du dialogue, etc. Dialogue in English is translated as dialogical life in communion. So these ideas of dialogue and so let's say of framing a sort of progressive politics that is not, however, confined to certain given traditional kinds of categories, but opens onto other sorts of concerns and therefore is hospitable to a genuine sort of mobilization, mass mobilization. These are the sort of things one should consider, right?
Thank you for your elaborate response on that. And I believe this is the last question. And for this, we will take you back to your reading of Stephen White's weak ontology. Could you please explain weak ontology in relation to strong ontology with the help of an example?
That I did give those examples, right? For example, the sort of instances of strong ontology I mentioned. One is in the context of, let's say, capitalist society, the individual who, in a way, embodies and practices what is called possessive individualism. Right? Possessive individualism. In fact, this is a phrase that was formulated by C.B. Macpherson, who was a Canadian political theorist of the last century, the second half of the last century. And so he finds this notion of possessive individualism at the root of even of liberal thought. Many strands of liberal thought. In fact, he formulated this idea in the context of his interpretation of 17th century English thought. C.B. Macpherson formulated this idea. And here what happens is, when you're talking about possessive individualism, two things happen. One, of course, the individualism part, which is where society somehow is seen in atomistic terms, so that every individual is, as it were, a Swayambhu kind of an entity, and that is perhaps in the worst case scenario pitted against other individuals in a sort of Hobbesian fashion. But also, the possessive part is very important. And that is the idea that you really define yourself in terms of property relations. The individual, even, Macpherson points out that the whole ideology of rights, which we now take so much for granted, it has its roots in this. That is, it stems from the idea of self-ownership. Why do I have rights? It is because I own myself. Right? Therefore, I have this right to life and so on. And even what you call right to property, this stems from the fact that I have, in 17th century, Locke, for example, had this notion that I own this piece of land if I mixed my labor with it. So, again, in that sense, so ownership, private property, etc., this is very central. And therefore, a society that is based on the idea of individual ownership of assets, of course, and therefore the related notion of accumulation of property, and therefore the idea of the market and the the market itself becomes a central metaphor, and society itself, social relations or political relations too are seen in terms of market relations, etc. Right? The idea of this free market, freewheeling market mechanism. So this is part of. This is one example of what's called this strong type of ontology. And the other example was given was that of the party state. Now here, this is the other end of the spectrum. So that now here what you have is there's no question of now having individual autonomy, etc. But the parties controls the state, and so the party state regulates all aspects of life, and everything is perfectly planned and controlled, and so on and so forth. Okay? And it's as if all relations, social relations, are transparent to this party state. And society and people are malleable, as it were. Right? And again, here now, therefore, it's a freewheeling kind of an entity, the party state. So it's this sort of thing. Right? Whereas, as I said earlier, this weak ontology would be one which has a sense of its own fallibility. It respects its background, that is things like tradition. It doesn't mean, of course, doesn't mean slavishly following that tradition, but there is a certain sense of embeddedness. Right? You are not a freewheeling autonomous individual or freewheeling party, all-powerful party state, etc. Okay? So whereas the strong ontologies have some kind of a sense of hubris built into them, here you have what Camus would call sophrosine, that sense of mesure, etc. And perhaps I would, let's say, I mean, Camus' own example I have given you throughout. His can be called his philosophy of rebellion, okay. The philosophy of revolt. Uh, that is itself an example of weak ontology, and I would say that Gandhian politics also, in many ways, would be an example of weak ontology. But there are some problems there definitely, because Gandhi, philosophically speaking, because Gandhi had very strong views on God, I mean the existence of God, etc. But here too, that lends itself to different interpretations, because remember, he initially said God is truth. His God was not this kind of traditional type of all power, omniscient God and so on, omnipotent. But then he started saying truth is God. Okay, so Gandhi again very complex, but I would say that on certain interpretations, Gandhian politics would be, I think, fairly good example of weak ontology in that sense.
And would you elaborate a little on this notion of folds and creases in terms of weak ontology, and how that comes through in Camus' works?
I know now that's it's very tricky terrain, no doubt. It's very slippery sort of terrain. But what I tried to do was, is the sort of argument that needs to be read really, because there are things that you can. Oh, my battery is running low apparently. That. Uh, uh, because there are some arguments that get a little dense and that do not lend themselves to explanation in this format, and with all the limitations of time and so on, and lack of real interaction in that sense. But what I was trying to point out was a certain contradiction in which various philosophers have pointed out, like Herbert Hochberg, for example, pointed out this contradiction quite some time ago, an analytical philosopher actually he is. And he says that, as I said, that look, he is rejecting suicide in the myth of Sisyphus, and he says that's meaningless. I mean, by committing suicide, actually, what you're doing is you are also committing some sort of philosophical suicide. Actually, you are you're not really solving the problem of absurdity. You're just running away from it, etc. And then, however, and he says the body's judgment is as good as the mind's, and the body recoils from destruction, but self-destruction, that is. But on the other hand, he says the rebel, when he is compelled to commit a murder, to kill an oppressor, would virtually, sort of stick his neck out and virtually court something like capital punishment. So that means what is happening? This is a kind of suicide. So how do you reconcile these things? So therefore, I tried to point out that perhaps the crease that holds them together in some kind of precarious unity is this sort of notion of love. And then I therefore went on to elaborate on the idea of love and friendship and so on and so forth. So that was, but it may not convince everybody, and that's not what Stephen White is saying. That's what I'm saying this. Stephen White gives the framework of being.
Right, and it also makes a lot of sense, because a lot of his works tend to emphasize on the strange idea of friendship that sometimes emerges towards the very end of the story, and this idea of love that is feebly there, but then that is the central idea that brings the story together. So in that sense, I'm quite impressed by this idea of looking at his work through the prism of weak ontology. Perhaps more work can be done on it to elaborate on it and to see exactly how it can be applied to his works. So with those words, we thank you for your elaborate answers. And over to Jay Prakash, who is going to offer a formal vote of thanks to you.
Thank you, ma'am. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, Prakash, we can hear you.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So, good afternoon, everyone. So here we come to the end of the fourth session of the International E-Lecture Series. So I, Jayaprakash, on behalf of Departments of English and French, Pondicherry University, India, would like to thank our resource person, faculties, participants, and everyone. I once again would like to thank Dr. Mangesh Kulkarni for his enlightening lecture on Albert Camus, our contemporary. Thank you, sir. I would also like to thank Dr. Kalpana and Dr. Ritu, our organizers, who has worked tirelessly behind this event for making this event a success. Thank you, madams. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our PhD scholars, Leenu and Harita, for all the background work and the technical assistance. Thank you both. And last but not the least, I would also like to thank all the participants for your time, for your patience and your queries. Yes, finally, before we wrap up, I just want to give a quick reminder that the next session is on 7th September at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, which is by Dr. Jonathan Webber from Cardiff University, UK. And the topic is what is existentialism. So all these like the links will be shared to your registered email address. So with this we conclude, and we hope to see you all in the next session. Till then, stay home, stay safe, and do take care. Over to Dr. Ritu and Dr. Kalpana. Thank you.
We would also like to thank Jay Prakash because he is the pillar of our technical team, and he forgot to mention himself.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Professor Mangesh. Thank you so much. It was wonderful hearing you.